fabulous listeners. Welcome back to the Elevated Feminine podcast with your co-host, Nicole and
Jenn.
Yes, we're back with another amazing and inspiring guest today. We have the lovely Angela Prider with us, and she's here to talk to us a little bit about microdosing for deeper spiritual connection. So I'm really excited about this. Microdosing has forever been on my list of bucket list items of one day we'll do. And friend of mine that is also a friend of Angela's has often offered to do it with me. So I'm super excited to learn more about it today. Sure. Angela's going to talk to us about that. So Angela is an animist healer, somatic counselor, microdosing practitioner, and a ceremonialist. So as the creatress of sacred life, animism, a spiritual way of living based on mysticism, healing, and folk medicine, she has been leading transformational gatherings and retreats all across the globe for over 20 years now. And through her sessions, programs, and apprenticeships, she's helped over 5,000 people reconnect with their inner landscape of their soul, which is an amazing number of people. That's incredible. And I love that. And I can't wait to hear some more about what you do, Angela. So I'm just going to lead you into your story. And so tell us more. Welcome, Angela. We're happy to have you.
Yes, welcome.
Thanks so much, Jen. Thanks so much, Nicole. It's really great to be here. I know that we've been talking about this for a while, so I just love it when we finally land together and get to have these conversations. It's awesome. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I guess a bit of background, I think maybe that might help you. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. How did you get into microdosing and your world? You do so many different things.
Yeah, I do different things, but they actually all kind of weave together, you know? Cool. So, I was born and raised in Australia. So I know, whenever people say to me, like, who raised you? I'm like, the beach raised me. Like that's like my soul's home, right? So, and I think so many people who are in the healing arts or, like myself as a counselor, we often go through that journey of the wounded healer. And, I grew up in multi-generational alcoholism. And I think that this pretty much means that automatically there's this multi-generational trauma. And I also wasn't aware growing up that I had ADHD. So, I had this very, very strict Catholic upbringing. And I was a highly sensitive child, extremely creative, and I had these intuitive gifts. And I just could not fit into this mold of like that being that really contained, conservative, Catholic school person, right? And I really think that by the time I was a teenager, I was really just trying to cope. And the way that I coped was I drank and I drugged. And I also think on maybe a conscious, unconscious level, I don't know. But I know that sort of by the time I reached like 15 to 17 was a very, very dark time for me. And I went through, a lot of trauma at that time. And it was a time that I made a decision to really turn my back on my soul, on my true self. And I made a decision that I was going to make myself fit into the mainstream. And at the time, I was in art school and I just blew that. I spent a lot of time in the bar, as an underage drinker kind of thing. And I was just kind of had that moment of like deep, deep depression of like, I don't seem to be able to be in life as myself. So I am going to follow what I see everybody else doing, and I'm just going to do this thing. And, I had some help getting a job. I got this job as a medical secretary, and, I became sort of independent. I moved out of home when I was about 17, 18. And I think, having all that income and then, my ego, as it does, it's not a bad thing even at that age either. It's kind of developmental. But I really partied hard. I was really spent a lot of time in the club. And you know what? That was okay for a few years. But honestly, by the time I was 21, I had an ulcer. I had anxiety-related skin condition. And at 23, I went into therapy. And honestly, when I went into therapy, my drinking and drugging sort of exacerbated. It really increased. And, there I was, sort of 22, 23, sleeping with a paper bag next to my on my bedside table. Oh my God, there's a hummingbird right outside my window right now. Oh, sorry.
Wow.
Just came right up to the window. Yeah. I'm just sending some love to that 22-year-old me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was sleeping with this paper bag on my bedside table because I would wake up in the night with severe panic attacks. And I did what many, many Australians do and what many alcoholics do, and I did a geographical cure and, got a working visa to come away to Canada. And so I took off for a year, and, wherever you go, there you are, right? And what actually happened when I got away from the structure of my work and my family was my drinking increased even more. And I was in a very precarious position. I was in my mid-20s by this time. And I think I'd been in Canada for, I don't know, 10 months. And I ended up getting sober. And that's a whole other episode. So, but right from pretty much the moment I got sober, spiritual healing became a very, very important part of my life. And I think that even though I grew up Catholic and there was a lot of really negative things about organized religion and the dogma, and what it did to me, really, there were some things about that stuck that actually served me well. One was that I really did believe in some sort of universal power that was love, and I really did love ritual, and it really gave me a very private place that I could take my pain, because Catholicism is about pain and guilt, right? But it honestly, now that I look back on it, Catholicism was one of the Christian religions that did keep some kind of feminine, and Mary was a very, very deep connection for me. So right from when I got sober, which was over 30 years ago now,
Oh wow, congratulations.
Yeah, thanks.
Congratulations on that.
I became part of a women's circle, and our focus was that we wanted to explore the goddess. We wanted to explore the sacred feminine. And we were all in recovery, and we were all pretty beat up, and we got together every week for about 3 or 4 hours, and we would have a women's circle. And, it was pretty grassroots. It wasn't women's circles like they are now. It was there was a lot of snot and a lot of tears, But I was in that circle for a number of years. I'm still friends with those women, which is so beautiful. A friend of mine then began to take me to the sweat lodge here in Musqueam territory in Vancouver. And I think the moment that I sat in the sweat lodge, something got activated in me that was oh my God, I can still have this connection with spirit. And it doesn't have to be under this umbrella of this organized religion. And that was profound. And, from that very early stage in my recovery, within about 4 or 5 months of being sober, I started to practice meditation, and I immediately found that when I meditated, that I could go into this trance-like state, and I was starting to meet these, what we would call spirit guides. And this happened really easily, and some of these spirit guides called me, they told me that they were my ancestors. And, one of my spirit guides was Jesus, and one was Mary Magdalene. And right from the get-go, I found that I had this capacity. I think this is, the sight, as we would say in the Celtic way. I had the sight. I could do this thing. And I was so like desperate at the time because, humility and spirituality go very well together.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would do this thing every day, and I did not tell any of my friends about it. I was terrified, like what people would think, but I would do these, now what I later understood as shamanic journeys. And I would ask my spirit guides, like, what do I do about my life? How am I going to get through my day sober? And then about 4 years later, fast forward 4 years later, and I was going back to school to, um, for counseling. I decided, I needed to, get my act together even more. And that's when I discovered shamanism. And that just felt like this is the most normal, natural thing for me. I can go into what I now understand are journeys. I understand that I'm having all this spiritual healing around my soul. Um, and it was just like the most, I don't know. I wish I could describe it, but it was just like the most, my soul was just like, yes, this is what we do. This is what we're meant to be doing. I just kind of found my home. So um, that was amazing. Now, around about the same time, I found shamanism. I really began to have my own practice for my own healing. I also started to go to somatic therapy. And I discovered for me that going to therapy, and I, at this point, I had been in therapy for probably about 10 years, like talk therapy and other things. And I discovered in somatic therapy that when we're going straight to the nervous system, um, that I was getting amazing results. That combined with my, shamanic journeying, working with spirit guides, I started to actually have some joy in my life, and I started to become much more resilient. And this PTSD that I had had, I was getting, breaks from it. And that is when things really changed around for me dramatically. And fast forward another, I don't know, 6 or 7 years. By this time, I had met my daughter's father, and I gave birth to her. And I had worked for about 10 years in the social services in all kinds of different agencies, working in addictions and working here in the downtown east side and working for, women's centers. It was fantastic 10 years. But after she was born, I went into private practice, and I began to weave together these elements that had transformed my own life. And that was, doing this folk healing or, somatic counseling. And then, do another fast forward, I don't know how many years later, probably about, 2 or 3 years later, I began to have a whole bunch of, some people might call them dreams, but there are dreams and there are big dreams. And these were like visitations from my ancestors in Ireland. And I just knew that I had to follow them, that something was happening. So then, over this period of about 7 years, I completed these 5 ancestral pilgrimages to Ireland and really dived deep into the old folk healing ways of my ancestors. And then around about this time is when the plant medicines came into my life. So this is probably about 2012. And all of these things kind of came together. So ancestral remembrance, plant spirit medicine, somatic therapy, and animist practice or shamanic practice all were kind of a massive part of my life and have been sort of these 4 foundational medicines in my one-on-one work and my events and my apprenticeship and basically everything that I do. So it's been thousands of hours in circles with these incredible wisdom keepers and spiritual teachers, from around the world. So I feel very, very fortunate that even though it's been quite an alternative route of education because, it's been sort of 20 years. I feel like I have this PhD in, in this thing. But I just have found that when those four kind of foundational medicines are together, that it really allows us to live consciously and be a much more skilled human being, right?
Yeah.
Especially in times like now, right?
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. I love hearing people's stories and what got them to where they are, because I know my own story, and sometimes I'm like, oh gosh, I wonder, like I've been through a lot. When you give yourself credit, we've all been through a lot.
Yeah.
And you just never know what people's stories are, and you see them where they're at now, and whether you would classify it as in a good place or a bad place. You just don't know what their story is and what they're going through even now. So I just find it so beautiful to hear your story, because I've heard a lot about your now, but of course your origin story is really inspiring. And so thank you very much for sharing. The one word
Yeah.
that came up that really like popped up for me was resiliency. It's one of my favorite words.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is a really big part of my mission. I really saw this during COVID, and I saw it after the murder of George Floyd. I'm
Mm,
seeing it now at the moment. Like, I think in a lot of our mainstream culture that, we don't have a lot of tolerance for complexity.
mm,
And I don't think we have a lot of I think we could do with some more spiritual resilience. And, what I mean by spiritual resilience is, yeah, this capacity to be able to understand that there is always a story behind the story, and therefore compassion is key. That there's nuance in everything that we do. We must learn how to find the sacred space between the this and the that, like in our
mhm,
body as an embodied practice. And I think that spiritual resilience is also about like learning how to practice being in the here and now, because really
mhm.
that's where everything is happening anyway, right?
Definitely.
um, yeah, so I think that that's such an important part of my work. I want people to be wiser. When I talk about being more skilled human beings, it's like, how do we cope, during really complex times,
Mm,
Yeah, I think we're just programmed now to react. Everything is so instant, everything you can get right away. And there's not enough time taken to just pause and contemplate for a second, and your mind can turn over things really quickly. So why can't you take that pause to understand, okay, well, maybe this is where this is coming from. But no,
Yeah.
we just react right away, and it usually goes sideways more often than not, because it's
Yeah,
not that impulses are bad, but when it's a complex situation, if you can take a moment to take at least a breath or two, before we respond, it would be. I love that. I wrote it down. The sacred space between the this and the that.
yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. And, I think that, you know, we don't we are really, particularly, in the last 10 years or so, particularly since we've had handheld devices. And this is another huge motivator behind why I do what I do is we have lost our capacity, or we are losing our capacity for self-orientation, you know? Like your soul is it's your guide, you know? And
mm,
right now we are so conditioned, exactly as you were saying, Jen, just about looking outside of ourselves for the answers. Like when we don't know something, what do? We go straight to the Google goddess, right? And it's like, let's hang on for a second. Let's see what it's like to not know. Whoa, can you imagine that? And
Mm.
this, when we don't know, it's a good thing because we return to this place of the great mystery, and we return to this place of it really is a feminine place. These really are skills connected to the feminine. of not knowing, of being in the mystery for a while, of let's sit and let's wait, let's be with the unknown, let's be in kind of chaos. I moved
Yeah.
into my home about a week and a half ago, and I've been on this journey of conscious uncoupling with my ex for about 5 years. Very non-mainstream thing to do. And we each now have our own apartments, and he's an extremely organized, like gets the job done person. And then there's me, hence why we live in separate houses now. And,
Gosh.
I just went over to his place. Our family had dinner last night, and I was like, oh my God, he moved in 3 days ago. He's completely set up, right?
That
So
would be
amazing,
You're still trying to figure out where's everything.
right? And I am here, and I'm like, I bought a couch before I moved in. I don't have an area rug. I don't have a television. I don't have even a coffee table. There are still a few boxes to unpack. And the couch that I ordered, I don't like. So they're coming back to get it, and I'm getting a different one. And, there's this part of me, I think part of it is also kind of, in my recovery around my ADHD, that really has that negative voice of like, God, what are you doing? You've been here for a week and a half, for God's sake. And another part of me is like, hang on here for a second. Let's just stop, because there has been a death really in my life of letting go of the family constellation as it was. And now I'm in this completely new place, and my daughter goes between both of us. And I just have given myself permission to be like, this is okay. Mother Earth, at this time of the year, she's really in her death phase here. We're coming up to Samhain. And until February, she is going to be still, man. She's like, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not doing anything. I'm just resting. And often in our own lives, we have to let the earth go fallow so that what's new can come forward, right? So
definitely.
and this is something we do not have tolerance for in our mainstream world. We do not have this. We're like, what do you mean you don't know? What do you mean? What do you mean you don't have, a coffee table yet?
Yes, totally. I love that the idea of going into stillness. And when we come back, I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into that and talk a little bit more, because it's so I love relating the seasons to business, to life, to menstrual cycles, to mindset, all of that stuff. I feel like it all comes together. So I'm super excited to dig into that. So when we come back, we'll be back with Angela. We're going to dig a little deeper into the season of autumn, maybe.
Hi there, I'm Jen, co-host of the Elevated Feminine podcast, where real women have real conversations. If there's a topic you are passionate about and want to share your views and ideas, then we want to hear from you. Send us an email at elevatedfeminine9@gmail.com. We can hardly wait to have a conversation with you.
Awesome. Well, welcome back, listeners. You're listening to another episode of the Elevated Feminine podcast. We're here with Angela Pryder and my co-host, Jen. She's here too. And we're talking about spirit journeys and sacredness of spirit and connecting with our true essence. And Angela has been sharing a lot about her story. And we ended the first part of this episode with talking about the seasons and how the seasons are actual, like autumn, summer, winter, spring, but that they also relate to every little aspect of the cycles of our lives, of our businesses. So we kind of want to pick up from that. So we were talking about how we're going into autumn, and how, Angela, what you were saying, how Mother Earth is kind of winding down now and going into this great pause through winter. When we were on the break, you were talking about how microdosing is actually like spiraling through the seasons. I'm really interested to learn more about that, because I'm really fascinated about the interaction of seasons with life and business and mindset and all of that. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. In the apprenticeship that I teach, it is, it's a 12-month, excuse me, apprenticeship. And I've just finished, excuse me, I, I've just finished my intake for this year. So if anyone's listening and they want to get onto the wait list for next year, yay, welcome. Um, but we actually start at Samhain. We start at the beginning of November. This is the Celtic New Year. And, in the ancient Celtic way, although around the world there are, many different sort of medicine wheels, quite often they start, with the rising of the sun. But the Celts really understood that the day began at night. So when you went to sleep is when the day began. And the dreams that you had in the night were not something about necessarily just letting go of your day. They were to help you the next day when you woke up and you came out of that dream state and you moved into your day. Then the dream was there to help you live your life. So,
I love that. I like that shift in perspective.
Yeah. And even when you go to sleep at night, it is your winter in your 24 hours, right? So it's also how we start life. Like we start life in the dark of our mother's womb. And that's where our life begins, in this very internal place of winter. We're just this little seed that's resting, embedded in the earth of our mother, in her womb. And then, we come out into the spring. So, I had been teaching the apprenticeship for about 10 years before I came to plant spirit medicine. And, when I began to sit in psychedelic ceremony, and it was a very traditional sort of experience for me. I spent about 5 or 6 years and sitting in many, many ayahuasca and wachuma ceremonies. And then in about 2016, when I was in Ireland, my teacher basically said to me, you really should be working with psilocybin. Like, this is an ancestral medicine. And, and the moment I sat with psilocybin, I really could see how all this work with my ancestors just clicked with that particular plant. And when I was sitting in psychedelic ceremony, I was like, oh my God, this is like a little microcosm of our 365, of our cycle around the sun, right?
Yeah.
It's like you ingest this psychedelic, and then there's this period where you're waiting for it, depending on which psychedelic you're working with, right? You're just waiting for it to arrive. And it's a time of quiet. It's a time of nothingness. It's a time of waiting. And, it's like the winter. It's the very, very beginning. And this is the place in wintertime, as we were talking about earlier, that people have the hardest time with. We do not like waiting. We do not like not knowing, and this is where we do have to develop, wisdom and spiritual resilience to just stay with our breath and, take things one breath at a time, 1 hour at a time, 1 day at a time, And then generally when, the medicine kicks in, it's like the spring. It's, kind of like, oh, wow, something is beginning to happen now, right? And am I going to freak out, or am I going to stay grounded? And am I going to remain open? Am I going to allow this to unfold? And this is no different from like, you're single and then you meet somebody and then there's some chemistry going on. It's like, oh my God, okay, what am I going to do here? And then of course, when the journey unfolds, it's like this full-blown experience of, all the things happening that plant spirit medicine gives us, whether it's visions or experiences or healing or whatever unfolds. And then there is the autumn. And, often I remind people when it comes to, psychedelic ceremony, like once you're over that really big part of it, don't just think it's done. like, our culture is what I like to call the eternal summer. We're just all about being on all the time. This is why we're all burnt out, because we just live permanently in that season. But
The sun.
autumn, right? And we live in the eternal summer, and we're like, we're youth centric.
Mm,
And but autumn is such a powerful time because it's the time of reflection. It's the time of beginning to rest and beginning to see. When you think about it, it's the harvest time, right? So it's like, what did I learn? What have I learned? So when it comes to microdosing, you know, I like to say that microdosing is a spiritual supplement. It can be used for many different reasons. Microdosing is this powerful thing, powerful practice when it comes to people who have depression or sometimes anxiety or whatever it is that people are, using, developing a microdosing practice for. Because I have, this practice as an animist healer, I like to look at it through this spiritual lens. And it can be an incredible supplement for your spiritual practice because it does allow us to connect more deeply with nature. And people are so disconnected from nature. And once you're disconnected from nature, you're disconnected from those seasons. And when you're disconnected from those seasons, you are living in the eternal summer. You're not giving yourself permission to rest or to let go, and
yeah.
really learn the wisdom that is provided for us through Mother Earth.
That's so powerful because there is so much to be said about the pause, and in meditation and in yoga and all these different practices we talk about, like yoga, we talk about how your life is not measured in years or days. It's actually measured in the number of breaths you take. So can you slow down your breath and extend your life cycle and actually be in the space? And it's not a literal translation necessary, but it's more about like actually living your life, not in this panic frenzy, but like slowing down the nervous system so you can actually be present and experience whatever is happening, whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable. Like I moved away from using good and bad a long time ago because there's this connotation with it, right? That, the winter is not bad. It is what it is, and it serves its purpose, and it is necessary in the climates that have a winter. I mean, Jen, even you guys in Barbados, you might not get the cold that North America gets, but even you have your cycles. You still have, the rainy season, and there's this beautiful cleansing, if you will, of the Earth's palette that I think is so important. And it really does come down to that pause. You need to pause, you need to break, you need to rest. We need the pause in the day. Nobody can go for very long. I can't remember how many days a person can go without sleeping before their body basically shuts down, but I know they use that for torture. So, like
Totally.
The pause is so important.
Yeah, and I think that this cycle, the cycles within the cycles are what I like to call it. Like once you begin to live from a cyclic place, which is feminine, the masculine way is much more linear, but living from your cyclic nature, once you start to do that, oh my God, so you become so empowered. I mean, even in yoga, when I think about it, there is the cycle of yoga, where you start and then you build into the summer of doing whatever it is. And I know that I went through a period at yoga when I would call it the autumn of like a yoga class, for example, when I dread it because, you're doing all the standing postures, and then it's like, okay, now we're going to move to sitting on the mat.
Yeah.
Okay. So I went through this period. This just shows me how tired and burned out I was, where I was like, no, we can't go down to the mat because if I sit down, I am going to go immediately into the winter of Shavasana. And And I just started to allow myself to do it. I would get, okay, we're going to move to sitting, and there's all these sitting postures, or, let's recline, and we're going to do whatever, boat pose or whatever. I'm like, I'm done, man. I'm going straight into Shavasana. I'm exhausted.
I love that so, so much. It's so, honestly, I can remember a time too when I started yoga that was me too. That's the beautiful thing. Yoga kind of helps highlight where you're at now. And so I think it's really like sometime the summer, especially in a power class where you have the warm up and the build up, and it's hard, especially if you get a hard teacher. It's hard. And I sit there through the whole thing and I'm pushing and I'm just like, oh, why do I do this? And then, like you take that off the mat and into your life, and it's the same sort of deal. It's the same sort of deal, right?
Yeah, 100% for sure.
I guess in a yoga class, you kind of slow down enough to notice. But when you're in your everyday life, you don't see that push because it's expected, more or less, in some instances, to continuously push, and be busy, busy, busy. So yoga really does force you to look at a lot of those things. It really does. Yeah, unless of course you numb out and you decide, I'm not going back to that class. I didn't like what came up for me. I'm going to find a different class, stuff like that. It's really interesting. So this might be taking us a teeny tiny bit off topic, but I wanted to ask a question, Angela, and this is for our listeners too. You mentioned that, well, I wanted you to name the plant that you were working with because I didn't quite catch the name and I can't even begin to imagine how to spell it. But you had said that there were, depending on which psychedelic you're working with, that it can help you with different things, anxiety, depression, etc. Is there a certain plant that is most appropriate to work with a particular thing that you were aiming to treat or help yourself with, or what have you? Or is it just you go to one, you use one that you are more naturally drawn to, or something like that? Just for my own personal understanding and for our listeners as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. It's a good question. I mean, first of all, just to be clear, microdosing is taking around, it's a very, very tiny dose of a psychedelic so that it is a sub-perceptual experience, or really you can perceive it because you do feel slightly enhanced, or like I like to say shiny, but it's sub-hallucinogenic. Like you're not having visions, you're not, there's none of that going on. You're just noticing a slight difference, in how you feel. Now, primarily I work with psilocybin mushrooms, so that's that's the plant that I microdose in my own life. Some things to first I'll answer your question, but I have been through a period where I microdosed cannabis. I really just wanted to get to know that plant, to understand that plant, and I had a history of abusing that plant medicine, when I was back in my drinking. So I wanted to really come into right relationship with that. But people can microdose all sorts of psychedelics and experience different results. So some people have microdosed, ayahuasca or wachuma San Pedro, which is mescaline, cannabis, ibogaine, and some people also microdose LSD. And that's really, James Fadiman was sort of like the researcher dude that, really dived deep into, rather than taking these huge psychedelic amounts for healing or therapy or whatever, this is a long time ago, what would happen if we just took these tiny little amounts? What would occur? And so, that's where microdosing with LSD came in. So there are some different results. So because psilocybin is connected to your serotonin uptake, psilocybin gets really good results for people potentially who are suffering from depression. Now, for me, with what I've been through the last 5 years of this conscious uncoupling, although it has turned out to be the best thing and everybody's in a good place. Oh my God, the grief of that, was like overwhelmed me. And I did not want to take, you know, an antidepressant because I already had a relationship with psilocybin through doing deeper medicine journeys, with facilitators and with my teachers, right? So I was like, I'm just going to give this a try. Now, what I discovered in my own experience, because I also have ADHD, I had to really fine tune the dosage. And that's the key with microdosing. And it's why you would have a microdosing guide. You would work with them for a period of time. And when I'm working with my clients, they usually work with me for about 6 weeks because we want to look at what is going to be the right dosage for you. So with psilocybin, for example, it's recommended, a tenth of, a therapeutic or a deep dive dose, right? So it's suggested between 100 and 200 micrograms, for example, of psilocybin, right?
Interesting. So it's like adapted for every individual.
Yeah, this is why you work with somebody because they recommend that amount. But for me, I take 40 micrograms. That's my max. I do not need more than that. And I know some clients, they only need to take 25 micrograms, whereas other people, they might need more than that. So it really, really depends on a lot of things. Sometimes if you have a history of anxiety, microdosing cannot be the best thing. It can exacerbate the anxiety. It really just depends. I have not tried it, but I have heard that, LSD can be very helpful for ADHD. So I find that psilocybin does help my ADHD, but I have to be very careful about where I'm at on any given day, what I've got going on. And so it really depends on the dose. It also depends on the protocol. Would you like me to talk about that, the protocol?
Actually,
Oh,
sorry, go ahead, Nicole.
I was just going to say, there's so much info here. I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel like you need to be doing like a master class on this.
Yeah. But I was going to say that, yeah, we can definitely segue into that. But I just want us to take a quick break and digest, because that was a lot. And of course, me, I'm making my notes. I've got my questions. So yes, we're going to take a quick break, listeners, and we're definitely going to come back and continue chatting with Angela about microdosing and all the things. So this is fascinating. Thank you so much. We'll be right back. Hi there, I'm Jen, co-host of the Elevated Feminine podcast, where real women have real conversations. If there's a topic you are passionate about and want to share your views and ideas, then we want to hear from you. Send us an email at elevatedfeminine9@gmail.com. We can hardly wait to have a conversation with you.
Welcome back to the Elevated Feminine podcast, friends. We are here with Angela Pryder, and she is such a fountain of information and being so generous with all of the details and information about microdosing. And I know Jen and I are so appreciative of this because we're both like sitting here with our chins in our hands, like, wow, just listening to your stories and all the information you're sharing. So we were talking earlier about, like what plants, and you were explaining how the different plants and the different doses depends on individuals. And so I was wondering if we could just kind of come back to the tail end of that conversation and talk about the protocols that you had mentioned earlier. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So microdosing, you're taking a micro sub-hallucinogenic amount of a psychedelic, and then it's, well, how are you going to take that? When are you going to take that? What's that going to look like? And there are many different protocols out there. There's the protocol of, 2 days on, 1 off. That came from James Fadiman, but he's since said that, well, we really did that for research, And then Paul Stamets has a protocol of 5 days on, 2 off. Now, I tried both of those and I found they were both sort of too much for me personally because I'm, a highly sensitive person that needs a very, very small, like microdose basically. And so I think it's the Microdosing Institute's uh, protocol for depression that I use, which is 1 day on, 1 day off. And so I will use that protocol, and usually I have a cycle of about 4 to 5 weeks. And then I have a break because you don't want to build up a tolerance to the medicine that you're using. So um, that's when we're talking about what it is it that you're going to microdose, what is going to be the best protocol, what's going to be the best dosage for you, what's going to be the best protocol for you, what's going to be the best cycle for you, and what are your intentions? What are the if you're going to be microdosing, why are you microdosing? How do you want to do that? And then in my one-on-one work with people anyway, we also bring in ritual and meditation and nature connection as, using microdosing as a spiritual supplement to get your spirituality, get you more connected spiritually.
Beautiful. I love that.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about your one-on-one work?
Yeah, sure. So, because I've worked as, a somatic counselor for, I don't know, 17, 18 years now, primarily the people who come to work with me are looking at the spiritual healing of their trauma. Quite often people have come to me and they've done therapy, they've worked out what's gone on with the trauma. They've even worked things out. They feel fairly peaceful emotionally, but they're still having, nervous system reaction. They're still triggered and they're like, yes, I know what these triggers are. Damn, And they're also curious about, what does this mean that I went through this thing? Like, what is this about? What's going on for me spiritually or on a soul level? So generally people, when we're bringing in microdosing into the work, we bring microdosing into doing, somatic healing work together. And quite often in my work, I'm supporting people to, I'm leading them like on a guided spirit journey to meet spirit guides, etc. And microdosing pre-appointment is so powerful because people are just a little bit more open, and normally they wouldn't be able to get there without that just little tiny enhancement of microdosing. So generally people work with me in sort of a 6-week cycle where we get to know each other, where I do a health assessment to see if that's going to be right for them. People do have to source their medicine because it is still illegal in most countries. So people have to figure that out. I don't supply the medicine. And then we sort of will have an intention over that 5 or 6 week period of like, yeah, there's this thing going on in my life where I'm really looking at changing my career, or I'm really looking at my parenting, or I'm really looking at, my relationships or my people pleasing. And then we weave in these practices of journeying and somatic embodiment with microdosing.
Wow.
Beautiful. Sounds so powerful. Sign me up.
It is. People get really amazing results, and some people then know how to microdose, so they're comfortable continuing microdosing sort of on their own, or they take a break for a while, take a break from your therapy, or take a break from your soul work, to go out and integrate some of the internal work that you're doing into your external reality, right?
Yeah. Are you going to say something, Nicole?
No, I'm just like, oh, I want to do that. It makes me want to come back to Canada. I'm in France right now. So.
Well, all of that work I do over Zoom, so you can do it.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, I work online. Yeah, primarily. Yeah. Yeah,
well, that's
primarily.
great to know. Oh, good. So listeners, you can get in contact with Angela and have a session with her online. So do you want to tell us you can give us your information. We will also drop it in our comments or the description for this podcast to let people know how to get in contact with you and to work with you. And oh gosh, my brain just completely spazzed. What I was going to ask you next. I know you mentioned your apprenticeship, and I know you're at capacity, but could you let us know when the next cycle would begin so that people can keep that in the back of their mind so they can look out for that in the future?
Yeah, sure. So my website is angelaprider.com. And, what I say to people is if you go onto my booking page, angelaprider.com/book, you can just book into my office hours and have a little 15-minute discussion, and we can just chat about what you're needing. angelaprider.com/apprenticeship is where you can go to check out the 12-month journey there, and you can get onto the wait list for the next intake. You can also find me on Instagram. That's where I'm there the most, at Sacred Life Animism. And just connect with me over there for sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
Beautiful.
Okay. Gosh, I mean, okay, just sitting here listening to it, and Nicole, yes, you have to love us and leave us, right?
Bye.
Okay, Nicole. So yes, listeners, Nicole is going to dip out, but I'm going to stay on and ask a couple more questions, and Nicole will be with us again soon for our next recording. But yes, Angela, what I was saying is, as I was listening and thinking about this, the fact that you're going through things, and I'm someone that I don't know where it first started. Maybe from the time I was a kid, I've always asked the question why. I've always had this innate desire to understand things. And I remember, and I probably said this before in the podcast, that when I was a little girl growing up, I thought that I wanted to be a psychiatrist because I was always fascinated by human behavior. The why we do things, react the way that we do. And I never pursued it, completely forgot about it. And for a long time, I was just wafting through life, not sure what I was going to do, and ended up becoming a yoga teacher and a Pilates teacher. And I've found throughout my years, having been through many different things, I've still had that innate desire to understand the why things keep happening to me and all those sorts of stuff. Primarily myself, because I can't do anyone else's work for them. I can only do my own. And hearing you talk about how your clients are going through things and they want to come to you to get some help with the microdosing, I immediately started to feel a little bit nervous and anxious about it. Just hearing it, because I'm like putting myself in their shoes and thinking, because as much as you want to know the why of things, you don't want to know the why of things. You know what I mean? Because it's scary. There's a reason why we've been kind of seeing it, but not really poking at it. And how do you, you're so incredibly calm. Your voice is really, really calming. And this is online, everyone, but I can feel the energy coming from Angela, and she's super calm, and I feel safe, even though the anxiety is there. How do you, navigate all of this? You're sitting there watching this person have this experience from the inside out. Have you had was there a session that you've had, whether online or in person, that was kind of like maybe a little bit scary or a little bit surprising, or, I don't know, because I don't know how I'm going to respond to it, and neither did that person, right? So I'm just wondering, this is a really long winding question. Are you still following?
Yes, I know. I totally am. No, I get you, Jen.
I'm just wondering, did you ever have an experience where you're like, whoa, you know what I mean? And how did you have to talk them into it when they decided to make the appointments, to say, okay, you're here, you booked this for a reason, so take your time. Like, how, on average, how long does the session go? Do you have to talk them off the ledge? All those sorts of things is what I'm here asking now, because I'm curious.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, the most poignant thing that you said there for me was about the why. We do want to know why, and it's important to know why, and it's important to face things, because it's important that we're conscious, because the more conscious we are, the more empowered we are about our choices in life, right? And we can stick our head in the sand all we want, but we have a whole epidemic of mental health and addiction. And I think, we have a global epidemic. Right now, we have like multiple crises happening in the world, like all at the same time. And mental health is one of those. And I think a lot of the mental health problems are often because people know that there's something there. They know that there's a why, but they don't want to look at it, and they don't know how to look at it, and they're afraid to look at it. I will just share something, that I think is also really key, and why I think, somatic work is so important. A lot of the time, we are not facing things because we're afraid of the emotions that are going to come up.
Yeah.
And there are two things that come from a patriarchal culture. One is that, feelings are bad, right? And that altered states of consciousness, this is a big part of colonization, altered states of consciousness are weird and bad as well, right? That you're just going to be in this reality and not be having too many feelings. When you grow up in that social context, the neural pathways that you need to have those feelings, they're not downloaded. So this is why when people experience grief, for example, they can't cry. They don't know how to cry because their neural pathways are not set up to cry. So, this is what makes people resilient. We talked about resilient at the beginning of our chat, is that you have the neurology that is going to allow you to have those feelings. And this is where microdosing is really powerful, because it's kind of like this tiny little nudge. With microdosing, you're not feeling it, like you're not aware that you've taken like a medication. It's not like a deep dive psychedelic therapy session. They're two very, very different things. There's a difference between 200 micrograms and 2 grams of medicine, for example. So this is why I love to do a health screening with people, because I also want to know where people's nervous systems are at. My nervous system needs to meet my client's nervous system, and then I can get a sense of their capacity and then how we can navigate our way. I hope that answers the question a bit.
I think so. It's such a long question.
No, it's fine. And I think that people, you have to remember, we've grown up in this culture, in the 60s, 70s, 60s, 70s, the war on drugs happened. So many of us have grown up with this whole thing about drugs are bad and, psychedelics are bad. I mean, in my personal opinion, there's a reason why the war on drugs came around about the time of Vietnam, right? The Vietnam War, because if you have a whole massive population that are taking psychedelics saying, hey, we're all connected, how are you going to get people to go across to the other side of the world and kill people when they know that they're connected? So so we've grown up with all this rhetoric about, how psychedelics are so bad and they're so dangerous and all of this kind of thing. No, this is why, if you're going to do a psycho-spiritual journey of a large amount of psychedelics for your healing, and to look at why, and to transform why, and to come out more integrated and wiser and stronger and resilient, you do want to be with a very, very experienced facilitator to do that. You want to be with somebody, like in most indigenous cultures, shamans train for 7 to 8 years. And it's the elders who let them know if they're going to be the medicine person for their people or the healer. It's not a person who's been down to Peru, who's done, a week and a bunch of ceremonies. Like, they have got no idea of what can potentially go wrong in a deep dive psychedelic ceremony. So, you want somebody who's been doing it for, I would say, 7 to 10 years, who's sat in hundreds and hundreds of ceremonies, who has training and who understands, how to hold a safe space. But with microdosing, because it's tiny, having a guide to get you started and to support you through a process is really helpful.
Well, listeners, Nicole is back. Yay! So just to catch you up to speed, Nicole, I had asked Angela if because I was feeling anxiety just listening, being someone who was coming to Angela for a session, and the desire to understand the why of things, but also the fear, because you want to know, but you don't,
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if, because I can feel the energy from her, that she's very calming and has an amazing capacity to hold that space. But how do you don't know if the person's going to flip out, even though it's you don't know. I mean, you might be, because I felt anxious just listening to it. So you've made the appointment, you've come into it ready for it, but then the anxiety might go way up, and could there be an impact? So that's what we were talking about.
Well, and I find that interesting just coming in at Angela, your response is that because there is that fear I feel like is that programming that drugs are bad, psychedelics are bad, right? And it's interesting because the subtext of that is if you abuse them, right? So it's kind of like sugar is bad if you abuse it. Butter is bad if you abuse it. Food can be bad if you abuse it, right? So there's like the missing piece of that statement that has been conveniently left out, and because even for me thinking about Jen, I would feel very similar because I'm part of that rhetoric of, like even smoking. I had a really hard time, in teenagers, you try it, right? But I was so secretive. I was curious about it, but then I was worried about it. And like even marijuana, it was like, I want to try it, but I'm scared what might happen. And so I find that it's interesting that I think there's a lot of people out there who maybe like us, Jen, who are curious about it, but stop ourselves because of that story that's out there.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that we do have that programming. And I think, what's a really, really important thing to remember here is, well, for starters, I have this background, of alcoholism and drug addiction, right? So when I came to psychedelic medicine, I was very, very nervous about that. Very nervous because I was afraid that I would relapse. I was afraid that it would take me back to drinking. It would take me all sorts of places. And, I have, wonderful teachers and elders in my life. And I was speaking to an elder about this. And I said, I'm worried about this because of my history. And he just said to me, Angela, there are very, very different things between, for example, going to a psychedelic ceremony or a psychedelic therapeutic space, psychedelic therapy appointment, and using drugs. First of all, like when we use drugs, what happens is we're generally using them to numb us, to numb our feelings. But when you go to a psychedelic ceremony, you're going there to have your feelings.
Yeah, right? To face them.
Yes. And when you are using or abusing drugs and alcohol, you're using it to get away from yourself and get away from your problems. But when you're coming to, for example, a microdosing series with me, or if you're going to a psychedelic ceremony, you're using it to face yourself and meet yourself. Yeah. And the other big thing about, using or abusing substances or any kind of process addiction is that generally it's very isolating. Right? And this is why I'm so big on the apprenticeship is all about community, because when you're using and abusing things, you end up isolated. Whereas when you're coming to psychedelic ceremony or you're working with community, you're coming back in connected to community. This is a very, very different thing. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you for pointing that distinction out, because I think that's a super important key difference. Aside from the obvious, using versus abusing, I think that's also key, obviously. But I think the more subtle, obvious distinction is that isolation versus coming back to community.
Yeah, coming back to connection, right? Yeah.
Well, we could definitely talk about this for another hour or two or more. But I think we're just going to invite Angela back for a part 2 and maybe even a part 3 conversation. So we're going to wrap up shortly. But Angela, before we go, do you mind just recapping your one-on-one offers? And yeah, just for our listeners so they can make a note of that. And yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So you can find me at angelaprider.com and on Instagram at Sacred Life Animism. And, just come, and I've got a little office hours time where people can come and just have a little 15-minute chat, and we can sort of discuss where they're at and what might be helpful for them. And to see whether this 6-week cycle of the microdosing cycle, which can be a massive catalyst, with those things. People like, yeah, I really want to work on this thing. It's like, great, let's focus on that for 6 weeks and, get the microdosing protocol, the cycle, all of those things set up, the intention really, really clear to do that sort of 6-week, piece of work to help people with their transformation. So, yeah.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, listeners, for being here. This has been another riveting, goosey bumps type light conversation with Angela talking about microdosing. I've learned so much. I'm so intrigued. We have amazing guests on our podcast. If you're not listening, tell your friends, tell everyone, and join us back here on The Elevated Feminine, where real women have real conversations. Until next time, Nicole and Jen and Angela, we are out.